Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a conflict you've probably never heard about in school, yet it shaped the geopolitical fate of Southeast Asia and revealed the true nature of colonial power. We're talking about the Malayan Emergency, how a war that wasn't officially a war turned an entire nation into a testing ground for surveillance, censorship, and control. But first, let's set the stage. Before 1948, British Malaya wasn't just some distant colony, it was an economic lifeline for the British Empire. With Europe in ruins after World War II, Britain needed cash. And where did a good chunk of that come from? Rubber and tin, two commodities Malaya had in abundance. Malaya's exports of these resources weren't just useful, they were essential. In fact, they accounted for a significant portion of British trade revenues in the post-war recovery. If you want to understand why Britain clung so tightly to Malaya, look no further than its economic arteries. But behind this economic engine was a labor system that ran on division. The British didn't just exploit resources, they engineered society itself. They divided labor along strict racial lines. Malays were mostly tied to agriculture, the Chinese were pushed into tin mining, and Indians were placed on rubber plantations. This wasn't random, it was policy, a calculated system of racial segmentation that made each group economically dependent, socially isolated, and politically manageable. It fostered deep socio-economic inequality and ensured that no one group could unify easily against colonial power. Then came the disruption, Japanese occupation during World War II. It was brutal, but it also did something unexpected. It cracked open the colonial shell. The Japanese had displaced the British, even if temporarily. And in that vacuum, local populations began to imagine something dangerous, life without empire. Nationalist sentiments surged. Communist movements gained ground. The myth of British invincibility was broken. So when Britain returned after the war, it faced a population that had tasted the possibility of self-rule. But instead of reforming, Britain tried to reassert control. It moved swiftly to re-establish its authority, but now it was dealing with a much more politically conscious and organized population, one increasingly united by a shared sense of anti-colonial resistance. This is the volatile mix: economic exploitation, racial division, post-war trauma, and rising nationalism. And it's exactly what sets the stage for what's to come. Now let's talk about the spark, the moment when long-simmering tensions boiled over into open conflict. After World War II, Malaya wasn't just recovering from colonial rule and occupation, it was choking on economic hardship. Inflation soared. Wages? They stayed flat. The cost of living skyrocketed, and ordinary workers, those toiling on plantations and in the mines, felt the squeeze most of all. It was a recipe for unrest, but instead of easing the burden, British colonial authorities doubled down. They cracked down on union activity, suppressing labor movements that had become lifelines for frustrated workers. Imagine trying to feed your family while your real wages are shrinking, and then being told you can't even organize a protest. The frustration grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Now add another layer: ideology. The Malayan Communist Party, already active before the war, gained momentum in this chaotic environment. They aligned themselves with the larger global wave of leftist movements that had gained strength after the war. And they didn't just speak to factory workers or radicals, they spoke to the youth, the jobless, the disillusioned. For many, communism wasn't about Marx or Lenin, it was about fighting back against a system that felt rigged. Then came the trigger. In 1948, a series of assassinations rocked the country. British plantation managers were gunned down in targeted killings. Whether these attacks were part of a broader communist uprising or isolated events is still debated. But to the British, they provided something very useful: a justification. Just days after the killings, the colonial government declared a state of emergency. But here's the twist: they didn't declare war. They declared an emergency. Why? Because insurance companies wouldn't cover losses caused by war. That one word, emergency, would shape everything that followed. With the emergency came sweeping powers. The British government granted itself the authority to detain people indefinitely without trial, censor the press, and forcibly relocate entire communities. And they did it all without the formalities or scrutiny of a declared war. In other words, colonial control didn't just return, it escalated. Under the guise of emergency, Britain transformed Malaya into a laboratory for population control, counterinsurgency, and psychological warfare. The match had been lit, and the fire was just beginning. Alright, so the emergency has been declared, but how do you fight a guerrilla war without losing control of the countryside? Enter the Briggs Plan, one of the most ambitious and disturbing population control experiments of the 20th century. The logic was simple, at least on paper. The British believed that rural Chinese villagers were providing food, shelter, and information to communist insurgents hiding in the jungles. So, they cut the cord. Over 500,000 people, mostly poor, rural Chinese, were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated into what the government called new villages. Sounds harmless, right? But these weren't quaint rural upgrades. They were barbed wire encampments. Imagine being told to leave your land, your animals, your community, and being dropped into a fenced-in settlement with limited food, restricted movement, and constant surveillance. These weren't villages. They were containment zones, militarized ghettos designed to sever insurgent supply lines by isolating the population. And here's where the question of liberty versus security really hits. The British claimed these relocations were necessary for safety. But safety for whom? The relocated villagers were treated not as citizens, but as potential enemies. They lost access to their land, to traditional livelihoods, and to the kinship networks that gave rural life its meaning. The bonds that held communities together, those were broken almost overnight. With every relocation, Britain tightened its grip. Surveillance increased. Access to food, water, and mobility became tools of control. People couldn't move without a permit, couldn't work without approval, couldn't speak freely without fear of detention. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was a system of total administrative centralization. And in the process, Britain created an artificial dependency. When people rely on the state for everything, housing, food, protection, they become much easier to control. But at what cost? The Briggs Plan didn't just target insurgents. It transformed the very structure of society. And while it may have weakened the rebels, it also hardened the lines between ruler and ruled, between liberty and obedience, between a nation and the foreign power still pulling its strings. This was counterinsurgency through bureaucracy, through planning boards and village gates. And it marked a turning point, because from here on out, the war wasn't just being fought in the jungle. It was being fought in the lives of ordinary people. Now let's talk money, because where there's empire, there's always economics in the background, quietly shaping decisions that look, on the surface, like matters of security or peace. By the early 1950s, the British realized that force alone wouldn't win hearts and minds. So, they opened the wallet. Funds poured into infrastructure, roads, clinics, schools. On paper, it looked like development. In practice, it was a pacification strategy dressed in economic clothing. The goal wasn't just to build, it was to bind. Every new road was a surveillance corridor. Every subsidized clinic was a reminder of who held the purse strings. This was strategic investment, not charity. And here's where it gets interesting. British authorities began using short-term spikes in GDP and productivity as proof that their authoritarian approach was working. If output was up, then surely order had been restored, right? But this logic glossed over a deeper truth. These gains came alongside tight control, rationing, censorship, and repression. In other words, the economy might have looked better, but individual freedoms were shrinking fast. Now let's talk inflation. Whenever a government starts throwing money around without balancing real productivity, it creates pressure. Prices rise, wages lag behind, and the very people who were supposed to be pacified start to feel the sting of economic manipulation. Inflation doesn't just hurt pocketbooks, it erodes trust. And when you're trying to win over a population already skeptical of your presence, that's a dangerous game. Then there's the military bill. By 1955, Britain had spent over £84 million on the emergency, most of it on military operations. That's a staggering figure, especially when you compare it to spending on civil services. Imagine what that kind of money could have done for real development if it wasn't being funneled into weapons, patrols, and barbed wire. So what was the real price of peace? A society built on centralized spending, suppressed dissent, and just enough economic growth to keep up appearances. It looked stable on the outside, but beneath the surface, the costs were mounting. Social tension, dependency, inflation, and a population living under constant watch. This was peace by control, and like all such peace, it came with a hidden price tag. If you thought this war was just fought in jungles and villages, think again. The Malayan Emergency was also a battle for perception, a war of ideas, headlines, and silence. Let's start with intelligence. The British didn't just want to defeat insurgents, they wanted to know them, predict them, dismantle their networks from the inside. To do that, they built one of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatuses ever seen in a colonial conflict. Informants, surveillance, interrogation centers. They mapped out communities like puzzle boards, tracking who talked to whom, who moved where, and who might be sympathetic. And if gathering information was one pillar of control, shaping information was the other. Enter censorship. The press wasn't just monitored, it was molded. Journalists were pressured to follow the official narrative. The government controlled what could be printed, what words were used, And what questions were never asked? Independent reporting on atrocities? Detentions? The brutal conditions of the new villages? That kind of truth rarely made it past the editor's desk. Even the term emergency itself was part of the strategy. Not a war, not an occupation, just an emergency, a bureaucratic inconvenience. One word helped sanitize a years-long campaign of forced relocation, mass detention, and military rule. Language matters, and in Malaya, it was weaponized. Then came psychological warfare. British officials crafted leaflets, radio broadcasts, posters, and speeches designed not to inform, but to influence. They didn't just want to kill the insurgent spirit, they wanted to replace it. Replace it with fear, with obedience, with gratitude toward the very system that had uprooted lives and erased dissent. Even surrender was rebranded. Former fighters weren't captured, they were rehabilitated, as if resistance itself was a disease to be cured. And here's the eerie part. It worked, not because it convinced everyone, but because it controlled the flow of information so tightly that few people outside Malaya even knew what was happening. Decades later, many historians still treat the Malayan Emergency as a footnote, if they mention it at all. That's not an accident. It's the result of a carefully managed narrative, a story told by the victors, scrubbed clean of its moral ambiguities. So ask yourself, if a war is fought, but no one hears the truth about it, did the victors really win, or did they just write better headlines? So what happened in the end? Well, on paper, Britain won. The Malayan Communist Party was defeated. The jungle insurgency collapsed. The emergency officially ended in 1960. Flags waved. Papers praised the brilliance of British counterinsurgency. It looked like a clean victory. But history rarely leaves things so tidy. Let's start with the short-term effect. The communist threat may have been crushed, but the divisions it exposed didn't just vanish. If anything, they hardened. The forced resettlements deepened ethnic separation, especially between Chinese and Malay communities. The new villages became permanent settlements. Entire generations grew up in the shadows of barbed wire and surveillance towers. These weren't just physical spaces, they were social scars. And what about the political system that emerged? The British laid the foundation for centralized, top-down governance that persisted long after they left. A strong executive branch, limited dissent, heavy reliance on internal security laws. In other words, the structures of control didn't fade, they evolved. Even the transition to independence in 1957 carried the fingerprints of emergency logic. The incoming government inherited not just a country, but a toolkit, one designed for managing unrest, not cultivating pluralism. So while Malaya became Malaysia and flags changed hands, the mechanisms of power often looked familiar. But here's the twist. Over time, legitimacy shifted. The new ruling class realized that tanks and censors weren't enough. They had to deliver material results. And so began the pivot toward economic growth, education, and infrastructure, this time not just as counterinsurgency, but as governance. A kind of economic legitimacy began to replace colonial force. Still, the memory of the emergency lingered, but it didn't linger loudly. It lingered quietly, in legal codes, in settlement patterns, in the way political dissent is viewed even today. It's a story often untold because it raises uncomfortable questions about how nations are shaped, not just by what they choose to remember, but by what they deliberately forget. So yes, the rebels were defeated, but the deeper tensions, between control and freedom, between imposed order and lived experience, those didn't end in 1960. They just changed form. So what do we take away from all of this? The Malayan Emergency wasn't just a military campaign, it was a blueprint for how governments, both colonial and post-colonial, can use fear, control, and bureaucracy to maintain order. But also, how easy it is to trade freedom for stability and not realize what's been lost until it's too late. Think about it. Entire communities uprooted, dissent rebranded as disease, propaganda replacing conversation, and all of it, every barbed wire fence, every censored headline, wrapped in the language of protection and peace. The deeper lesson here isn't just about Malaya, it's about how systems justify themselves, how control can be repackaged as safety, how memory can be reshaped into myth, and maybe most importantly, how quickly we forget. Ask yourself, why is the Malayan Emergency barely mentioned in history classes? Why is it not held up alongside Vietnam or Algeria or India as one of the great anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century? Maybe because it worked. Because the colonial playbook of control, carefully engineered, ruthlessly implemented, was so effective that even the memory of resistance was suppressed, not just by governments, but by the slow erosion of public attention. But here at Truth Behind History, we believe the past matters, not just the victories, but the uncomfortable truths, the stories that challenge us, the ones that whisper when textbooks go silent. If you made it this far, thank you. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, hidden stories, buried lessons, then do us a favor. Like this video, share it, drop a comment and tell us what you think. And make sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History so you never miss a forgotten chapter of our world's past. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description. Until next time, keep questioning the official story.